The desert night was cold, the kind of chill that crept beneath the skin no matter how many blankets a person had. Inside the dimly lit cabin, a lone cowboy leaned forward, the firelight painting his face in golden shadow. He had taken in a stranger, an exhausted woman who had stumbled into town with nothing but rags on her back and dust in her hair. She trembled as he laid a woolen blanket over her shoulders. Then she whispered words that struck him still. "I'm filthy, inside and out." The cowboy's rough hand hesitated, his breath caught. He pulled the blanket back just enough to look at her, and what he saw froze him in place. Before I tell you what happened that night, let me ask you something. Where are you watching this from right now, and what time is it where you are? Because in this story, time itself seems to slow. Every second matters, and every choice, every heartbeat can change a life forever. The late afternoon sun dipped low behind the jagged hills, casting long shadows over the little town of Dry Creek. Dust lifted in slow swirls along the main street where wagon wheels had grown through only hours before. The air smelled of horses, whiskey, and the faint tang of wood smoke drifting from the saloon stove. It was a place where everybody knew, everybody faces recognized, names remembered, stories repeated until they hardened into truth. That was why the sudden figure stepping out of the desert haze made so many heads turn. A woman. She moved as if each step was borrowed from the last, her frame hunched beneath the weight of exhaustion. Her dress, once pale blue, had been beaten into the same dun brown as the earth itself. The hem was torn ragged, hanging around her bare ankles. Her hair unkempt, brittle with dust, fell in clumps around her face. When she lifted her head, her eyes avoided every gaze, slipping away from the stares that followed her. Abigail Harlow had reached Dry Creek. No one knew her name yet, and few cared to ask. Murmurs fluttered among the porch railings of the mercantile and the swinging doors of the saloon. Men smirked into their mugs. Women pulled their children closer. "Look at her," someone whispered. Dragged straight from the gutter, she stumbled onto the boardwalk outside the general store and leaned against the post. For a moment, her knees buckled, and the crowd half expected her to collapse in the dirt. But she clung to the post with thin, scarred fingers and pulled herself upright again. From a shadowed corner of the saloon, a man lifted his gaze. Jonas Mercer sat alone, hat tilted low, a glass of untouched whiskey before him. He was not the sort of man to involve himself in town business. Years of riding fence lines and sleeping beneath the stars had carved him into a figure of solitude, broad-shouldered, quiet, with a face weathered more by silence than by time. But something in the way the woman swayed struck him. Not pity. Jonas had never cared for pity. It was something else, a recognition of sorts, though he could not yet name it. Abigail pushed herself away from the post and stepped toward the mercantile door. Inside, the shopkeeper sniffed before she had spoken a word. He lifted his chin, eyes narrowing at the dirt crusted along her sleeves. "We don't carry charity," he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. Her lips parted, but no sound came. She turned instead, retreating, her shoulders curling inward like a battered bird protecting its wings. She nearly collided with two ranch hands swaggering past. They laughed, brushing her aside. "Careful, sweetheart," one jeered. "Don't smear that filth on my shirt." Her cheeks burned crimson beneath the grime, but she kept her head down. She began to walk, no direction in mind, just away from the cluster of eyes and mouths. Jonas rose. His boots struck the floorboards of the saloon with the weight of decision. He drained his whiskey in a single swallow, not for the drink, but for the courage of movement, and stepped into the street. The crowd noticed. Jonas Mercer was not a man people ignored. Some tilted their heads, curious to see what he'd do. He crossed the dust slowly, deliberately, until he stood before the woman. "Ma'am," he said, voice deep but steady. Abigail startled, her eyes flashing up to meet his. For a heartbeat, she seemed ready to bolt, like a deer cornered by hounds. "You look like you could use a place to sit," Jonas continued. His tone carried no judgment, only the plain fact of observation. Her lips trembled. No one had spoken to her with gentleness in a long, long time. She shook her head faintly, as if refusing, but her knees betrayed her, wobbling under her weight. Jonas extended a hand. His palm was rough, calloused by years of ranch work. For a moment she stared at it as though it were a foreign thing, a trick waiting to snare her. Then, slowly, she allowed her fingers to fall into his. He guided her across the street, away from the whispers, down toward the edge of town where his horse was tied to the hitching post outside the blacksmith's shed. She nearly collapsed when he lifted her onto the saddle. He swung up behind her, holding the reins lightly in one hand, careful not to press against her frail form. The ride was quiet. The sun slipped lower, bathing the landscape in orange fire. Abigail swayed once or twice, but the steady presence behind her kept her from falling. Neither spoke, for words then would have shattered the fragile thread of trust that bound them. When they reached Jonas's cabin on the outskirts, a weathered place of pine logs and stone chimney, he dismounted first and helped her down. She staggered across the threshold, blinking at the warmth of the fire still glowing in the hearth. He fetched a blanket, coarse but clean, and draped it around her shoulders. She pulled it tight, sinking onto the wooden bench near the flames. Jonas poured water into a tin cup and held it out. She took it with both hands, trembling. For a long moment, the only sounds were the crackle of burning wood and her uneven breaths. Then, at last, her voice broke the silence. A whisper, hoarse from dust and fear. "I'm filthy, inside and out." Jonas froze, the words settling heavy in the space between them. He looked at her, really looked, and saw not just the grime, but the despair etched into every line of her face. He did not answer right away. Some truths could not be met with simple replies. Instead, he sat across from her, eyes steady, and let the firelight bear witness to a moment neither of them yet understood. The firelight wavered, licking shadows across the rough-hewn cabin walls. Outside, coyotes called to one another under the rising moon, but inside the cabin all was hushed except for the faint rattle of Abigail's breath. She clutched the blanket tighter, as if it were both shield and confession. Her eyes stayed fixed on the flames, refusing to meet Jonas's gaze. Jonas leaned back slightly in his chair, his hands resting on his knees. He was a man accustomed to silence, but this was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the calm of open plains or the stillness of a star-filled sky. This was a silence weighted with shame, trembling in every line of the woman before him. He cleared his throat softly, careful not to startle her. "There's stew on the stove," he said. His voice was steady, practical, as though speaking to a skittish colt. "Ain't much, but it's warm." Her head lifted a fraction, uncertain if he meant the words for her. When he rose and ladled out a portion into a tin bowl, setting it gently on the table between them, her eyes flicked toward it. Hunger betrayed her. He saw the way her fingers twitched against the edge of the blanket. "Go on," he encouraged, stepping back to give her space. Abigail hesitated, then lowered the blanket from her shoulders just enough to free her arms. She leaned forward, hands shaking as she wrapped them around the bowl. Steam fogged her face, and for an instant she looked almost startled by the simple kindness of a hot meal. She sipped, then swallowed too quickly, coughing into her sleeve. Jonas silently refilled her cup with water and set it near her elbow. When the worst of her hunger eased, the tears began. They came without sound, slipping down her dirt-streaked cheeks as if the stew itself had loosened something locked inside her. She pushed the bowl away and pressed both hands to her face. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered. "You don't know what I've done. I'm filthy, not just outside, but inside. Rotten clear through." Jonas's jaw tightened. He had heard confessions on cattle drives, half muttered between shots of whiskey, men unburdening themselves to the night sky. But this was different. The words came from a place deeper than regret. This was a soul convinced it was beyond redemption. He didn't answer with reassurances he knew better than to toss easy words against wounds so deep. Instead, he reached for something tangible. He walked to the shelf, pulled down a pair of old leather gloves worn soft by years of work, and set them beside her. She blinked at them, puzzled. "Put 'em on," he said simply. Her fingers hovered, then slid into the gloves. They swallowed her hands whole, too big, too rough for her slender wrists. But something about the gesture steadied her. Her shaking lessened. "Now you don't have to worry about what anybody sees on your skin," Jonas murmured. Her lips parted, ready to argue, but no words came. For the first time since she'd entered the cabin, she lifted her eyes to his. They were wary eyes, shadowed by years of distrust, but beneath the fear flickered a question. Why? Why was he doing this? Jonas met her gaze without flinching. He was not a man of many words, but the lines etched around his eyes spoke of long nights under cold skies, of battles fought in silence. He understood something about carrying burdens invisible to others. "What's your name?" he asked gently. Her throat bobbed as if the word itself might choke her. "Abigail," she said at last. The name sounded fragile, like a secret too precious to share. After a pause, she added, "Abigail Harlow." Jonas nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Well, Abigail Harlow, this is a safe roof. Safe don't mean easy, but it means nobody out there gets to lay a hand on you tonight." The fire cracked, sending sparks into the chimney. Abigail stared at him, lips trembling. No one had ever promised her safety without demanding a price. Suspicion flickered across her face, followed swiftly by disbelief. "You don't understand," she whispered. "They call me worse than beggar, worse than sinner. I ran when I should have stayed. I'm shame itself." Jonas leaned forward slightly, his forearms braced on his knees, his voice lowered. "Maybe I don't understand. Maybe I don't need to. What I know is no one deserves to starve alone in the dust. Not while I've got stew to share." Her shoulders shook, and she turned away, clutching the blanket back around her as though it could hide her tears. Yet something in her posture shifted. The rigid tension that had defined her steps through town softened, just barely. Outside, the desert wind whistled against the shutters. Jonas rose, adding another log to the fire. Its glow deepened, throwing warmth into corners long unused to it. He sat again, letting the silence stretch, not oppressive this time, but waiting. Abigail curled on the bench, gloves still on her hands, blanket cocooned around her. Her breathing evened, exhaustion overtaking fear. Within minutes, her head drooped, then settled against the wall. Sleep claimed her swiftly, like a thief stealing what little strength she had left. Jonas watched, his hat shadowing his eyes. He thought of his mother, years gone now, who had once taken in a stray girl from the trail despite the town's whispers. He thought of how kindness had cost her dearly and how he had sworn not to repeat her mistakes. Yet here he was, staring at another broken soul asleep under his roof. He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand across his face. "Safe don't mean easy," he reminded himself again. The fire burned lower, but its warmth lingered. Abigail stirred once in her sleep, murmuring something incoherent, before sinking deeper into rest. For the first time in years, she slept without the ground beneath her and the cold above. Jonas leaned back in his chair, the weight of choice pressing heavier than the revolver at his hip. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or whether the town would let either of them forget this night, but he knew one thing with clarity sharp as starlight: he could not turn her away. Not now. The morning came slow, spilling pale light across the wooden floorboards of Jonas Mercer's cabin. Dust motes drifted in the air, glowing in the shafts of dawn that pressed through the shutters. The fire in the hearth had gone to embers, but warmth still lingered faintly. Jonas rose early, as he always did, and moved about with the quiet discipline of habit fetching water, tending the horse, slicing bacon to lay in the skillet. He did not disturb the figure still curled on the bench. Abigail slept with the blanket tucked under her chin, her face slack with exhaustion, though the furrow in her brow never quite eased. When the smell of sizzling meat filled the cabin, her eyes fluttered open. She blinked, confused at first, then pushed herself upright with a start, as though ashamed for having slept. Jonas, seeing her stir, offered no greeting beyond a nod. He plated the bacon and a thick slice of bread, setting them gently on the table. "Eat," he said simply. Her stomach betrayed her with a growl. She flushed, pulling the blanket tighter, but hunger triumphed over pride. She edged to the table, sitting stiffly as though afraid to touch anything that wasn't hers. She ate in small, cautious bites, glancing up once to find Jonas watching her not with judgment, but with the plain patience of a man accustomed to waiting out storms. When the last crumb was gone, silence returned. Abigail's fingers picked at the blanket in her lap, twisting the coarse fabric. At length, she drew a shaky breath. "You should know what I am," she said. Her voice was low, weighted with dread. Jonas set down his tin cup. He didn't prompt her, but his stillness gave permission. She stared into the empty plate as if the words were etched there. "I was a wife once. to a man named Franklin Dade. He owned more cattle than most in these parts. More temper, too. Her lips trembled. At first, I thought God had favored me. A roof, meals, a name to carry. But a roof can be a prison if the walls belong to a man's fists. The confession hung in the air. Her hands shook, tugging harder at the blanket. When I couldn't give him children, his anger grew. He said I was cursed, unworthy, filthy. He reminded me of it with every bruise, every broken word. I stayed as long as I could bear, because in town they say a woman who leaves her husband is dirtier than a drunk in the gutter. Her eyes lifted at last, meeting Jonas's. They glistened with a rawness that dared him to turn away. So I ran, took nothing but the rags I wore. They say I'm a disgrace, a coward, that I brought shame on his name, and worse on mine. They spit when I pass. Children laugh. Even the church shut its doors. The blanket slipped from her shoulder, revealing faint yellow bruises still fading along her collarbone. Jonas's jaw flexed, but he made no move to cover her or to look away. He simply absorbed the truth she had offered, letting it land without denial. Abigail pressed her palms to her face. That's why I said I'm filthy, inside and out, because it isn't just the dirt on my skin, it's the stain of what people believe I am, and I can't wash it off. The cabin was silent save for the pop of the cooling skillet. Jonas rose and walked to the window. He looked out across the wide expanse of prairie, golden in the new light. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, his voice came quiet, but certain. My mother, he began, was once called worse than filthy. She took in a girl from the trail, orphaned and ragged. Folks in town whispered she was soiled, said Mama ruined herself by feeding her. But Mama told me something I ain't forgot. She said dirt washes, bruises fade, even names people throw at you, those wear out if you keep walking. But kindness, that stays. Abigail lowered her hand slowly. The tears on her cheeks caught the morning light. She searched his profile, waiting for the sneer, the dismissal. It never came. Jonas turned from the window, his gaze steady on hers. You ain't filth. Abigail Harlow, you're hurt. That's all. Hurt don't make a person rotten. Her lips parted, but no words came. The blanket slid further, pooling at her waist. She looked smaller without it, exposed but also less weighed down. Her shoulders eased a fraction, though her eyes still shimmered with doubt. Exhaustion pressed at her once more. The telling had cost her nearly as much strength as the walking had. Her head drooped, fighting sleep, but this time she did not resist. She let her body fold sideways against the bench, curling once again beneath the wool. Within moments, her breathing deepened. Jonas lingered a while, watching the lines of strain ease from her face as she drifted into slumber. He thought of the road she must have walked, the miles of dust and hunger, the cruelty of the town she'd left behind. He thought of Franklin Dade's name, rolling bitter across his tongue. When she stirred, murmuring in her sleep, Jonas set another log on the fire. He sat by the window, revolver resting across his thigh, and kept his silent vigil. That night, Abigail dreamed without fists, without jeers. For the first time in years, she dreamed of nothing at all, and that emptiness felt like mercy. Jonas, staring into the prairie dusk, wondered if he had the strength to keep her safe from more than hunger. He had weathered storms before, but never one that carried another soul's fragile hope in its wake. The embers glowed, shadows lengthened, and in the hush of the cabin, two broken stories began to braid into one. The following morning dawned sharp and clear, the kind of day when the horizon seemed endless, and every sound carried farther on the crisp air. Jonas saddled his horse before the sun had cleared the ridge. Abigail lingered by the doorway, her figure small against the frame, blanket still drawn around her shoulders like a fragile armor. You'll need more than stew and bread, Jonas said, cinching the saddle tight. Come with me into town. We'll get what you need. Her breath caught audibly. The thought of facing Dry Creek's streets again, the eyes, the whispers, it made her want to curl back inside the cabin. But there was something steady in Jonas's tone, a quiet certainty that left no room for protest. She nodded faintly, and he helped her mount. The ride into town was hushed. Abigail kept her gaze on the ground, fingers clutched tight to the saddle horn. Jonas rode beside her, tall in the saddle, brim of his hat cutting shadow across his stern profile. He didn't speak, but his nearness was shield enough to keep her from turning back. Dry Creek stirred awake as they rode in. Shopkeepers swept boardwalks. Women carried baskets. Children chased one another through the dust. Then the whispers began. Heads turned. A man nudged his friend. A woman pulled her little boy close, murmuring sharp words in his ear as she steered him away. Lord above, someone muttered loud enough for Abigail to hear. Dragged her filth right back here. Did she Jonas Mercer? Another voice sneered. Always was half wild. Figures he'd pick up what the coyotes left behind. Heat rushed into Abigail's cheeks. Her chest tightened until it hurt to breathe. She wanted to slide on the horse, to flee into the desert, anywhere but under those eyes. But Jonas's hand brushed her elbow lightly. Just a touch, nothing more. Yet it steadied her. They dismounted outside the mercantile. Jonas tied the reins, then offered his arm as though escorting a lady. For a heartbeat, Abigail stared at it, stunned. Then, trembling, she laid her hand there. Inside, the shopkeeper stiffened. He cast a long look at Abigail, then sniffed. We don't sell credit to the likes of her. Jonas's voice was flat but firm. Didn't ask for credit. I'll pay in coin. The shopkeeper's lip curled, but he fetched flour, soap, a length of cloth for a dress. When Jonas laid silver on the counter, the man glanced at Abigail with something mean in his eyes. Coin spends quick, he said, but stink lingers. Abigail flinched as though struck. Jonas didn't move, didn't raise his voice. He simply stacked the goods neatly, wrapped them under one arm, and turned to her. We're done here. On the boardwalk outside, the snickers continued. Two young ranch hands lounged against the hitching post, their hats tilted back. One spat into the dust. Mercer, you're hauling home trash. Sure you don't want us to fetch you a cleaner one? Abigail's throat tightened, tears stinging her eyes. She tried to pull away, to escape, but Jonas's grip on her arm remained steady, not forceful, protective. He turned his head just enough for his eyes to meet theirs. Mind your tongue, he said evenly. His voice wasn't loud, but the steel in it made the boys glance away. Abigail whispered hoarsely, Why do you stand beside me? Don't you hear them? Jonas adjusted the parcels in his arms, guiding her toward the horses. Let 'em talk. Their words can't starve you anymore. She stumbled, overwhelmed by the simple statement. It was the first time anyone had told her she didn't have to live under those voices. They rode out of town with the stares prickling their backs. Abigail twisted to look once, seeing the cluster of people watching, murmuring, pointing. She pressed her lips tight, shame burning hot. Then she felt Jonas's hand rest lightly against her back, steady as the earth itself. By the time they reached the cabin, Abigail's eyes were swollen from holding back tears. Jonas unpacked the goods without a word, setting the soap and cloth carefully on the table. He filled a basin with warm water, laid a clean towel beside it. You don't owe me thanks, he said, his back to her, but don't let their poison settle in your bones. You've carried enough. Her voice cracked. No one ever stood beside me. Until you. Jonas turned then, meeting her gaze. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held something firm, almost fierce. Maybe it's time somebody did. The wind rattled the shutters, carrying with it the fading sounds of town laughter, gossip, condemnation. Inside the cabin, there was only the soft crackle of fire and the first fragile threads of trust stretching between them. For Abigail, it felt like stepping onto solid ground after years of drifting. For Jonas, it was the beginning of a vow he had not yet spoken, but one he knew he would keep. The days that followed unfolded slowly, like a wounded bird testing its wings. The cabin, once a place of solitude, began to carry softer sounds, the scrape of a broom against the floor, the creak of a kettle set on the stove, the occasional, tentative sound of laughter that startled them both. Abigail rose each morning with hesitation, her body stiff and her spirit wary. At first, she kept the blanket wrapped around her shoulders as though it alone gave her permission to stay. But gradually, with Jonas's quiet presence nearby, she began to lay it aside. Soap and water from the mercantile scrubbed years of dust from her skin. The coarse cloth Jonas had bought was cut and stitched into a plain dress. When she caught her reflection in the basin's water, she barely recognized herself cleaner. Yes, but also less invisible. Jonas never pressed her with questions, never demanded explanations. Instead, he folded her into the rhythm of his days. He showed her how to stack kindling so it burned hotter, how to sweep the chimney with a tied bundle of sagebrush. When the roof leaked after a sudden spring storm, she held the ladder steady as he patched it with pine shingles. One afternoon, he brought in a basket of beans and asked her to help shell them. They sat across from one another at the table, fingers busy, silence easy. The shells dropped into a bucket, the beans piled into a bowl. Abigail broke the stillness first. "It feels strange," she murmured. Jonas glanced up. "What does this?" she said, gesturing to the beans between them. "Just doing something without fear pressing at my back." He studied her a moment, then nodded. "Strange don't mean bad." Her lips twitched, almost a smile. That evening, she tried her hand at cooking with the beans. The stew thickened too quickly, clumping at the bottom of the pot. When she tried to stir, the spoon stuck, and when Jonas leaned over to help, the handle snapped, splattering both of them with the sticky mess. For a moment, Abigail froze in horror, certain she'd ruined everything. Then Jonas blinked, stew dripping from his beard, and let out a low chuckle. It rolled into laughter so deep it shook his chest. The sound startled her, and before she knew it, she was laughing too, a rusty, awkward laugh that soon became unstoppable. Tears pricked her eyes, not from sorrow this time, but from the unfamiliar ache of joy. When the laughter faded, Jonas wiped his beard with the corner of his shirt and said, "Reckon it tastes the same. Spoon or no?" Abigail pressed a hand to her mouth, still smiling. It was the first time she had felt light in years, yet shadows lingered. Each time a rider galloped past the cabin, Abigail's body went rigid. The distant shouts of drunken ranch hands drifting from town at night sent her trembling into the corner. Jonas never scolded her for it. He simply stayed close, sitting on the porch steps with his rifle laid across his knees, or standing beside her until the sounds faded. One night, as the wind howled across the plains, she whispered, "I don't know how to stop waiting for him." Jonas didn't ask who him meant. He knew. He rested his hand lightly on the table between them, not touching hers, just close enough for her to notice. "Healing ain't about forgetting," he said. "It's about learning you're more than the hurt." The words settled deep. She lay awake long after he'd gone to bed, staring at the flickering shadows, turning them over in her mind. The next morning, she surprised herself by humming while sweeping the floor. The tune was faint, one she hadn't recalled in years, but it rose on its own. Jonas, outside chopping wood, paused mid-swing. He listened without comment, but a slow smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Later that day, Abigail ventured into the small patch of earth behind the cabin. She cleared rocks, pressed her fingers into the soil, and planted the handful of seeds Jonas had traded for in town. "Flowers," she said when he came around the corner, puzzled, "something to remind me that dirt isn't always filth. Sometimes it's where beauty begins." Jonas leaned on his axe, studying her as she knelt in the soil, hands smeared but eyes bright. He nodded once. "Reckon you're right." That night, as the sun sank behind the hills, they sat together on the porch. No words passed between them. The sky blazed pink and gold, the prairie stretching wide and endless. Abigail breathed deep, her shoulders uncoiled, and for the first time in many years, she didn't feel like an intruder in her own skin. Jonas turned his head slightly, his gaze steady on her. "You're not filthy, Abigail," he said softly. "You're just hurt." Her throat tightened. She wanted to believe him, to take those words and plant them deep like the seeds in the soil. Instead, she simply whispered, "Maybe hurt can heal." The evening breeze carried the faint scent of sage. The last of the light slipped away, but the quiet between them glowed with something steady, something new. The moon rose swollen and white over Dry Creek, spilling silver light across the prairie. In Jonas's cabin, the fire burned low, casting the room in a warm, steady glow. Abigail sat by the hearth, mending the hem of her new dress. Her stitches were uneven, but each one pulled her further away from the rags she had once worn. Jonas carved quietly at a block of wood on the porch, his knife scraping rhythmic against the grain. It felt almost like peace, but peace in the West was fragile, always one knock away from shattering. That knock came heavy against the cabin door. A drunken voice slurred through the wood, thick with venom. Abigail. Her needle slipped, pricking her finger. Blood welled bright against her pale skin. Her breath caught, body freezing. She knew that voice. Jonas stood, knife sliding back into his boot. His shoulders squared as he stepped to the door. The banging came louder. "You think you can run? Woman, think you can shame me and crawl into another man's bed?" Abigail shrank against the wall, hands trembling. "It's him," she whispered, eyes wide. "Franklin, he found me." Jonas's jaw tightened. He opened the door slowly, stepping out into the cold night. Franklin Dade swayed on his feet, the stink of whiskey rolling off him. His coat was dusty, hat askew, eyes burning with rage. He pointed a finger at Jonas. "You've got something belongs to me." "She doesn't belong to anyone," Jonas replied evenly. Franklin sneered. "She's my wife, my name, my property, and I'll drag her back if I have to break every bone in your body." Jonas's voice stayed calm, but steel edged every word. "You'll do no such thing." Franklin stepped closer, fist clenching. "Move aside. Mercer." From inside the cabin came Abigail's broken cry. "Don't, please, don't fight him. I told you I'm filth. He'll prove it to you." The words cut Jonas deeper than any blade. For years, this woman had been made to believe she was less than human, nothing but dirt. And now, in her terror, she offered herself up to the cruelty she had fled. Jonas turned his head, calling back through the doorway. "You stay inside. Abigail." Franklin lunged. Jonas met him squarely, fists colliding in the dust. The fight was brutal, fueled by years of rage from one man and iron resolve from the other. Franklin swung wild, drunk and clumsy, but powerfully built. Jonas absorbed the blows, driving him back with steady force. His jaw set like granite. They grappled near the well, Franklin spitting curses. "She's mine. Always was. Always will be." Jonas slammed him against the post, voice low and fierce. "No man owns a woman. Not now. Not ever," Franklin roared, drawing a knife from his belt. Abigail screamed from inside, stumbling into the doorway. Jonas caught Franklin's wrist, twisting hard until the blade clattered to the ground. With a final shove, he knocked the drunk sprawling into the dust. Franklin lay there gasping, too winded to rise. His eyes burned hatred, but his body betrayed him. Jonas stooped, picked up the knife, and hurled it far into the dark. Then he stood over the fallen man, chest heaving. "I won't kill you," Jonas said, his voice rough with exertion. "But hear me now, if you ever lay hand or word on her again, you'll answer to me." Franklin spat into the dirt, staggering to his feet. "She'll rot with you. Then, rot in her own shame." He stumbled toward his horse, mounting awkwardly. With a final glare, he rode off into the night, curses trailing behind. Abigail crumpled in the doorway, sobs racking her chest. Jonas rushed to her, kneeling. She tried to push him away, gasping. "You see, he was right. I bring nothing but ruin. He gripped her shoulders, firm but gentle. "No." Her eyes flooded, searching his face. "No," he repeated, steadier. "You are not filth. You are not shame. You are a woman who has survived hell, and that makes you stronger than any man who ever tried to break you." Her body shook, but she didn't pull away this time. He gathered her into his arms, her tears soaking his shirt. For a long time, neither spoke. The night pressed close around them, but in the circle of his embrace, she felt something she hadn't known in years' safety. When her sobs quieted, she whispered, almost afraid to believe it, Maybe I can be clean again." Jonas leaned his cheek against her hair. "You already are." The words sank deeper than any sermon, deeper than any judgment she'd endured. They didn't erase the scars, but they lit a lantern against the dark. Outside, the prairie wind carried Franklin's curses farther and farther until they were lost to the night. Inside, in the arms of the cowboy who refused to let her believe the worst of herself, Abigail Harlow began to breathe like someone alive again. The weeks after Franklin Dade's visit were marked by a hush, as though the land itself held its breath. Jonas rode the fence lines each morning, keeping watch for any sign of Franklin's return. Abigail tended the cabin, her hands busy from dawn until dusk, though her heart still startled at the echo of hoofbeats. Yet each day without trouble felt like a stitch mending torn cloth. Slow but sure, she began by scrubbing the floors. On her knees, she worked until her arms ached, soap and water chasing years of grime from the wood. When Jonas returned that evening, he paused at the threshold, boots muddy, hat in hand. He noticed the shine of the planks, the faint scent of lye. Abigail flushed, suddenly self-conscious. "Didn't mean to change things," she said quickly. Jonas stepped inside, his gaze roaming the tidy space. "Looks like home," he replied simply. The word home settled over her like a blessing. Soon, flowers sprouted from the patch of soil she had planted behind the cabin. At first, only fragile shoots, but then bright faces of yellow and white. She knelt among them, brushing the petals with trembling fingers. Dirt stained her palms, but she didn't recoil. Dirt was no longer shame, it was life. Jonas noticed her there one afternoon, hair catching the sunlight. He said nothing, only watched until she glanced up and caught his eye. For the first time, she didn't look away. Inside, small changes took root as well. Abigail stitched curtains from the plain cloth Jonas had bought. She aired out blankets, polished the table until it gleamed. She even hummed as she worked, the tune shaky at first, then steady. Jonas listened quietly, never interrupting. One evening, as the prairie sky blazed with orange and violet, Jonas returned with a sack slung over his shoulder. He set it on the table, gesturing for her to open it. Inside lay a simple book of hymns and a second-hand shawl, soft wool woven in pale blue. Abigail touched the shawl with reverence, her throat tight. "Why?" she whispered. Jonas shrugged. "Figured you might want something of your own. Not borrowed, not taken." Her eyes brimmed. She wrapped the shawl around her shoulders, inhaling its faint scent of cedar. "No one's ever thought of me like that," she said. Jonas shifted, uncomfortable with praise. He busied himself with the stove, muttering, "Figure it's about time someone did." The town, too, began to notice. At first, the whispers sharpened when Abigail appeared beside Jonas in the mercantile. But weeks passed, and she returned again and again, shoulders straighter each time. She paid for goods with coins Jonas pressed into her hand, meeting the shopkeeper's eyes without flinching. The gossip dulled, not gone, but softened by the proof of her change. A few women even nodded politely, curiosity replacing disdain. One Sunday, Abigail walked to the small church at the edge of town. Jonas rode with her, hat low, though he rarely set foot inside himself. She lingered at the doorway, fear fluttering in her chest, remembering the day she had once been turned away. This time, the preacher's wife stepped forward and pressed a hymn book into her hands without a word. Abigail's knees nearly buckled at the simple gesture. Back at the cabin that night, she told Jonas, "I thought I'd never be welcome in God's house again." Jonas studied her, then said, "Maybe God's house ain't four walls, maybe it's right here." He tapped his chest once, then gestured to the cabin around them. "And maybe it's wherever you're finally treated right." She smiled then, soft and luminous, and he felt the warmth of it settle deep inside him. The seasons shifted. Summer pressed hot against the plains, then gave way to the cool whisper of autumn. The flowers outside withered, but the cabin grew more alive than ever. Abigail baked bread that filled the air with yeasty comfort. Jonas repaired the fence with her steady hands passing nails and boards. One evening, as frost began to silver the grass, they sat on the porch, Abigail wrapped in her blue shawl, Jonas with his pipe unlit between his teeth. The sun sank low, spilling gold across the horizon. Their shoulders brushed, a small, steady contact that said more than words. Abigail broke the silence. "Do you ever think of what people still say? That I'm ruined, that I'm stained." Jonas turned his head toward her, eyes steady. "People say a lot of things. Doesn't make 'em true." She swallowed, gaze on the fading light. "Sometimes I almost believe I could start over, that maybe I'm not filthy after all." Jonas reached across the space between them, his hand covering hers where it lay in her lap. His touch was warm, grounding. "You're not filthy. Abigail, you never were. You just needed someone to remind you." Her breath hitched. For the first time, she let her fingers entwine with his. The simple gesture sealed something unspoken between them and understanding. A vow. They sat that way until the stars pricked through the darkening sky. Two souls who had carried ashes long enough, finally daring to believe in light. And as the night deepened, Abigail Harlow knew this truth. Sometimes it took only one quiet man's steadfast presence to prove that what the world called filthy could, in truth, be something precious, something whole, something worthy of love.